The NBA All-Star Game is supposed to be a showcase of the best.
Korver, rhythm bounce. Bury it, baby! Bury it!
The most dominant players, the biggest names, ones who can take over a game at will. Sometimes the NBA fumbles the bag. Whether it's injuries, a weak conference, or just an absolutely baffling selection. Some players have slipped through the cracks and landed on the All-Star team when they had no business being there. Today, we're peeling back the layers on these head-scratching picks. This is the top 10 worst NBA All-Stars ever. And first up, a name that might sound familiar for all the wrong reasons. 10. Wally Szczerbiak. These days, you probably know Wally Szczerbiak as that guy who randomly shows up on Knicks broadcasts, or the guy who confidently said something wildly incorrect about Tyrese Halliburton. But back in 2002, Wally himself was catching that same slander. Now, to be fair, Wally wasn't terrible. He was a great shooter and had a solid season, but 2001-2002 wasn't even his best year. He just happened to be the second leading scorer on a 50-win Timberwolves team, playing next to Pete Kevin Garnett, who was entering best player in the league territory. And history has shown the NBA loves rewarding second options on good teams, whether they deserve it or not. Meanwhile, Stephon Marbury, Anton Jamison, Shawn Marion, and Rasheed Wallace all sat at home while Wally snuck in. If anyone should be mad about fake All-Stars, it's them. Wally, he should just be grateful he gets to put NBA All-Star on his resume, because let's be honest, that was never happening again. Wally wasn't the only head-scratching pick. Up next, a player whose name is legendary in college basketball, but in the NBA, not so much. 9. Christian Laettner.
A 6'11" senior from Angola, New York, number 32, Christian Laettner.
If this were a list of college All-Americans, Christian Laettner's name wouldn't raise a single eyebrow. But an NBA All-Star, that still feels like a clerical error.
I thought Christian Laettner was soft.
Overrated. Pretty boy.
Look, Laettner had a respectable 10-plus year NBA career, better than most people remember actually. But his 1997 All-Star selection makes zero sense when you realize Reggie Miller and David Robinson were left off that year. Was he bad? No, he was a solid player on an Atlanta Hawks team that won 56 games. But solid isn't the same as All-Star worthy. He put up respectable numbers and played a key role. But let's be honest, no one was lining up to watch Christian Laettner highlights. And if you think Laettner's inclusion was questionable, wait until you hear about the next guy. He made an All-Star game alongside legendary Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. 8. Jayson Williams. Jayson Williams' story is one of the NBA's most fascinating and tragic. A charismatic leader for the Nets, his career was cut short by injury, but his real troubles came after basketball. In 2002, he accidentally shot and killed his limo driver Kostas Christofi, then tried to cover it up, leading to years of legal battles in prison. Struggling with alcohol and personal demons, he spiraled into multiple arrests and a very public downfall. He's since worked towards redemption, but on the court, he was a role player. With career averages of 7.3 points and 7 rebounds per game, his All-Star selection in 1998 remains baffling. Yet somehow there he was, shaking the floor with Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. Now, to be fair, he had a career year, averaging 12 points and 13 rebounds per game, which, hey, is a huge jump for a guy who usually hovered around 7. But let's not pretend the 1998 East All-Star roster wasn't rough. The starters included Cleveland-era Shawn Kemp, while the bench featured Rick Smits and Steve Smith. No, not that one. If that was the competition, suddenly 12 and 13 a night starts looking a lot more All-Star worthy. Williams at least put up double-digit points. The next guy, he made the team while Carmelo Anthony was left at home. 7. Andrei Kirilenko. If there were a Hall of Fame for elite role players, Andrei Kirilenko would be first ballot.
It's always nice to see evolution, but keeping a tradition like in line.
He was an elite defender, a Swiss Army knife, and the kind of player every coach loved. But an All-Star? That's where things get murky. Kirilenko had a strong all-around season in 2004, averaging 16.5 points, 8.1 rebounds, 3.1 assists, and 2.8 blocks per game. The problem? That wasn't exactly All-Star production.
Andrei Kirilenko from St. Petersburg, Russia. Kirilenko with it. He'll go to the hole. Moving up to the left-hand score. Incredible.
His selection felt more like the NBA throwing Utah a bone after Stockton and Malone retired, rather than an actual reward for individual dominance. Meanwhile, Carmelo Anthony, a rookie averaging 21 points per game and leading the Nuggets to the playoffs that year, was left at home. That's like inviting a solid backup singer to the Grammys while leaving an up-and-coming superstar off the list. But if Kirilenko's All-Star case was flimsy, the next one is even worse. This guy made an All-Star game while averaging 13 points per game. 6. Jamaal Magloire. 3 players from the 2000 NBA draft class made an All-Star team: Kenyon Martin, Michael Redd, and Jamaal Magloire. With Martin and Redd, it made sense. With Magloire, not so much. Yes, Jamaal Magloire was an NBA All-Star, and no, he wasn't an injury replacement. The year was 2004, and the NBA was in the middle of a full-blown center crisis, at least in the Eastern Conference. All the elite big men, they were in the West, and by all, we mean all. The West had Garnett, Dirk, Shaq, and Duncan. The East, they had Ben Wallace, Jermaine O'Neal, and Jamaal Magloire. To be fair, Magloire wasn't bad. He averaged 13.6 points and 10.3 rebounds per game. Decent numbers for a big man. But let's be real, does anybody remember a single Jamaal Magloire highlight? He wasn't a dominant force. He wasn't a franchise cornerstone. He was just a big guy who was available. Meanwhile, Michael Redd, Chauncey Billups, and Richard Hamilton all watched from home. And to make it worse, Magloire actually started the game, which meant he had to line up across from Shaquille O'Neal at tip-off.
Allen lost it. Davis with Magloire.
If that wasn't a sign something had gone terribly wrong, I don't know what was. But if you thought Magloire making an All-Star team was bad, wait until you see who got in over NBA veterans in 2007. 5. Josh Howard. Josh Howard was the perfect second or third option, a gritty two-way wing who fit beautifully alongside Dirk Nowitzki. But an All-Star? That's where things get dicey.
Looking, Howard's going to let it fly, and I'll count if it goes. Oh, he put it in from 3/4 court!
Howard averaged 18.9 points and 6.8 rebounds per game in 2007. Solid numbers? Sure, but nothing jaw-dropping. His biggest asset that season wasn't his individual play. It was the Mavericks' record. Dallas was 39-10 at the break. When a team's that dominant, the NBA tends to throw them an extra All-Star spot out of obligation. The only problem? That extra spot should have gone to someone else. Carmelo Anthony, averaging 25-plus points per game, was once again left off. Jayson Williams was snubbed despite being one of the best young point guards in the league, and Baron Davis was playing out of his mind. Meanwhile, Howard, while good, was basically Karen Butler, but less memorable. His All-Star career lasted 1 game, and by 2010, he was out of Dallas. If nothing else, this selection proved that sometimes winning too many games can be dangerous, because someone might mistake you for an All-Star. At least Josh Howard had a scoring touch. The next guy, he made the All-Star game because Charlotte needed representation. 4. Gerald Wallace. Gerald Wallace was the definition of a high-motor player, a relentless dunker, tough defender, and a guy who would dive for a loose ball in an empty gym. But being fun to watch isn't the same as being an All-Star. 2010, Wallace averaged 18.2 points and 10 rebounds per game, which is respectable. But let's not kid ourselves. His selection wasn't about individual dominance. It had way more to do with the fact that the Bobcats were semi-relevant for the first time ever. It was almost as if the NBA suddenly remembered Charlotte had a team and decided, fine, take one spot, just one. Meanwhile, Josh Smith, Carlos Boozer, and David Lee, all of whom had better cases, were left off the roster. To make matters worse, Wallace's style of play didn't even fit the All-Star game. He was a defensive-minded, effort-first guy in a game where defense is illegal and effort is optional. He probably spent the first half contesting shots before realizing no one else was playing defense and just started jogging like everyone else. But if Gerald Wallace was a questionable All-Star, the next guy was a full-blown mistake. He played on a 29-win team and got in as an injury replacement, but the league probably should have just let the spot stay empty. 3. Chris Kaman. Chris Kaman was an injury replacement for Brandon Roy. While his counting stats, 18.5 points and 9.3 rebounds per game, were decent, there wasn't much else about his game that screamed elite. He wasn't a dominant interior presence, wasn't a defensive anchor, and he definitely wasn't a fan favorite. He was just there. What makes Kaman's selection even stranger is that the benefit of the doubt almost always goes to established stars over first-timers. Yet somehow Kaman, like Steve Johnson before him, managed to sneak in as a one-time All-Star with no real case beyond raw stats. Meanwhile, Monte Ellis, Zach Randolph, and Carlos Boozer, all significantly more impactful players, were left watching from home. This was basically charity work by the NBA. Giving the Clippers an All-Star in 2010 was like giving a participation trophy to the slowest kid in a relay race. Nobody really earned anything, but it felt polite to do it. Kaman's selection was bad, but the next one, he was voted in as a starter over Tim Duncan and Marc Gasol, and 2 years later, he was out of the NBA. 2. Andrew Bynum. Andrew Bynum was talented, no one ever questioned that, but his work ethic, attitude, and knees, that's a different story. In 2012, Bynum put up 18.7 points and 11.8 rebounds per game, which are solid numbers. But let's not pretend he was dominating the league. In fact, he wasn't even the best big man on his own team most nights. Yet somehow, not only did Bynum make the All-Star team, he was voted in as a starter. That's right, he got more votes than Tim Duncan and Marc Gasol, two players who were actually impactful in ways that lasted longer than 2 seasons. And the worst part? 2 years later, Bynum was out of the NBA entirely. That's the basketball equivalent of winning an Oscar and then immediately switching careers to real estate. So how did this happen? Well, playing for the LA Lakers in the early 2010s was like having a golden ticket. If you were tall and wore purple and gold, you were probably getting an All-Star nod. But if Bynum's selection was bad, the next one might be the most undeserving All-Star nod of all time. He wasn't a starter. He wasn't a franchise player. He was a role player averaging 12 points per game. 1. Kyle Korver.
Kyle Korver, and he dunks again! Wow, 2 years went by quickly, and the Hawks lead 48-47.
Kyle Korver was an elite shooter. No one's arguing that. But an NBA All-Star with 12 points per game, that's where we need to have a serious conversation. In 2015, the Atlanta Hawks were playing beautiful, unselfish team basketball and shocked the league by winning 60 games before the All-Star break. The NBA, apparently feeling sentimental, decided to reward them with 4 All-Star selections, whether they deserved it or not. Al Horford, Paul Millsap, and Jeff Teague? Fine, but Kyle Korver? That's where things went too far. Korver's 12.1 points and 4.1 rebounds per game were solid for a role player. He wasn't a creator, he wasn't a dominant force, he was a specialist. A great shooter, yes, but the NBA is full of great shooters who don't make the All-Star teams. Meanwhile, guys like Nikola Vucevic, Brandon Knight, and Kemba Walker were left off the roster. Korver was great at what he did, but if the NBA was going to start handing out All-Star nods for elite shooting, then JJ Redick, Mike Miller, and Steve Kerr deserve retroactive selections too. And there you have it, the 10 most undeserving All-Stars in NBA history. The players who make you question everything you know about All-Star selection. But one thing's for sure, when we look back at NBA history, these are the names that still make us say, wait, how did that happen? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and check out our other videos for more basketball content. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear them.